Welcome to the Mother Earth News and Friends podcast. At Mother Earth News, for 50 years and counting, we've been dedicated to conserving the planet's natural resources while helping you conserve your financial resources. In this podcast, we host conversations with experts in the fields of sustainability, homesteading, natural health, and more to share all about how you can live well wherever you are in a way that values both people and our Mother Earth. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, Brinzea. That's BRINSEA, Chick Incubation Specialists. They've been focusing on egg incubator design continuously since 1976, resulting in egg incubators, chick brooders, and incubation accessories. They offer unparalleled practicality, reliability, superior hatch rates, and healthy chicks. Innovation you can trust. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Mother Earth News and Friends. I'm Jessica, and joining me today is Queren King-Orozco, also known as Q, and she's here to join us to talk about selling eggs. We're going to hear a little bit more about her family egg business and some of the things she learned so that you listeners can get some tips on potentially selling your own eggs to your community. So welcome, Q. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I think this is our third or fourth time we get to talk about chickens on the podcast.
I think so. It's always fun. So can you tell listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then I know you have a couple things coming up with us at Mother Earth News that we can plug.
Yeah, so I am Q, and if you are familiar with me from previous episodes or perhaps you've seen me around at our events, then welcome back, and it's great to have you. But if you are not familiar with me, I do a lot of different things, so it's kind of hard to keep track sometimes. But I am a master gardener, a certified aromatherapist, and I feel like an accidental chicken expert. I've learned a lot through Mother Earth News about chickens and started with chickens through Mother Earth News. And we did release a video recently that was all about getting chickens at your local farm store, and that was really fun. Those are the current chickens that I have right now. Actually, they're olive eggers that we got. And then we have a video coming up that is all about aromatic gardening. So how to grow aromatic plants. And I walk you through, what those plants are and why you would want to grow an aromatic garden. As an aromatherapist, that's definitely what I enjoy doing the most. I love any garden that has a great smell and that you can use herbs with. And so those things are coming up, and I'm really excited to see them. But yeah, so I spend a lot of my time gardening and with our chickens. And previously we used to have about, I think, roughly 45 to 50 chickens, and started an egg business for my daughter.
That's so fun. And today for this episode, we're going to be talking about, just like you said, smaller flocks, so under 50, but we will include some links in the show notes for listeners who may have larger flocks or plan on having larger flocks, 50 to 200, over 200, super large scale. There's a lot of different tiers when it comes to egg and chicken businesses, and it varies state by state. So today we're going to be talking about the small scale backyard chicken flock where you can sell eggs. But of course, if you are a listener who has a bigger flock and wants to learn more about that, we'll touch on that briefly in this episode, but we'll also include some resources where you can find the regulations and laws in your state, because that varies. But today we're going to talk about that small scale stuff, which I think is great because I think that's where a lot of us tend to be. We tend to have those smaller flocks in our backyard, and we might just be kind of looking for some new ways to use that flock in our daily life. So to start out talking about your egg business, how did that really come about? Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, so I feel like depending on the individual, you can get started thinking, I'm going to have an egg business and I'm going to get a bunch of chickens and that's what I'm going to do. Or you accidentally walk your way into it, which is sort of what happened to us. We started off with a few chickens that we hatched at Mother Earth News, and then we would go to the store and we would, of course, end up with more chickens because that's what happens. And we just really enjoyed having them. I think it all became like a family hobby, which was really nice because everybody was involved. Whereas when I'm gardening, sometimes it's just me. So we really fell in love with having chickens. And, I think maybe around 20 is when we were like, okay, we have too many eggs. What do we do with all of these eggs? And does it make sense to sell them? So I think originally we started taking them to church and giving them away. Like that was what we started to do. And then people started offering us money for the eggs. And we're like, oh, that makes sense. We're spending all this money on the feed and the care. I think we sold them for like $2, which is like not a lot. And then we started accumulating money, and we were like, okay, so what do we do with this extra money? And we were like, oh, our daughter, who at the time was like 3 or 4, could open up her own savings account. So we took her to the bank. I think we have a picture of her at the bank that day. And we opened this account, and it was, you know, all the egg business money, if you want to call it that, would go to that bank account. And then we just felt like we were really enjoying it. So we got more chickens. And so we ended up having about maybe 45, between 45 and 50. And that's like a really defining number, especially here in Kansas, because that's really what changes from like being more of a hobby business to an actual business where you're being regulated a lot more. So really we started out kind of for fun, and it really showed our daughter what it was to do all the work and then sell the eggs. So that's really how we got started.
Yeah, that's super fun. You'd mentioned how you started selling it just at your church and in your community like that. Were there any specific ways you started getting the word out more when you realized, oh, like let's actually make this a little bit more of a formal exchange?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like 2 things happened. First of all, we gave eggs away. And I think if you look at from the business perspective, that giving is like a really great way to do marketing. And so we gave eggs away, and then people were like, we really love your eggs. Could we have some more? And we'll pay for them. And so then people were like, can we get 2 dozen instead of 1? And so then, then it got a little bit more serious of like, okay, we have this many people on our list who want eggs, and how many eggs are we getting? So then we started to have to do some math of what was going on, and like writing down the names of people. Another way is I've always shared on social media what we're up to. And so, a lot of our friends and local people would follow me. And if we had a surplus of eggs, I would post like, hey, we have some extra eggs if anybody wants them. And people would post. Or, there was like a Facebook page for a group for that town. So we would post when we had extra eggs. I did take him to the office sometimes. And we actually got to the point where we had a waiting list because we only had so many eggs per week and so many chickens. I had to write down like who was who and who got them. So it kind of became a little bit more serious than my daughter is selling eggs and collecting money. The money still went to her, but we took it on a little bit more serious because you don't want to make people upset when they don't have eggs for their breakfast the next day.
Especially when they're on a waiting list.
Yes. And sometimes we would go to a place and like have the eggs. Sometimes we took it upon ourselves to just drive because we lived in the country. And so it was something that was fun for the whole family to do. And then, to go back a little bit, we started to notice like the prices of eggs. And this is all pre-COVID, so pre-pandemic. So we would go to the store to see what the egg cost was, to start to base ourselves off of that. That helped us understand like the cost that needed to be involved. And our eggs have always been really large because we let them forage and all of that. And then during the pandemic, the prices of egg went up significantly. So we did price them higher because we were getting more people asking about them. So you do have to do a little bit of homework.
Did you feel like there was any sort of pushback when you were determining some of the prices of your eggs at all? Or did you feel like people were willing to pay that price?
Well, I will say that in Kansas, I've always felt like eggs are a lot cheaper than other places because a lot more people sell eggs and have chickens. Whereas if you go to even if you go like into the city, I think the egg prices are really expensive. But I remember traveling for different reasons and being at a grocery store and looking at the eggs and seeing a dozen of eggs being like $8. And I was like floored. And I would be like, we're underselling our eggs. Or we would be driving in Colorado and we'd see a sign and someone was selling them for like $7 a dozen. And I was like, what are we doing? We're doing something wrong. So it was always being really transparent with people and being like, hey, the cost of feed has gone up, or whatever it was that was causing it, we would say it and we'd be like, our eggs are still available if you'd like them. We were never like pushing them on anybody or anything. And there were times where we would, if we had extra, we would say 2 dozen for this amount. So we got a little creative. The great thing about eggs is that most times people always need them. So there's always someone who's going to take, maybe they don't take 1 dozen, but or maybe they need more than a dozen. So they end up taking, I don't know. Sometimes we'd sell like 5 of them at once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Eggs sometimes feel like they sell themselves at times, especially because I feel like the really cool kind of marketing point there is like feeling closer to your community, knowing who, like where your eggs are coming from.
Yeah.
But were there any other like ways that you shared with people why buying local eggs versus going to the store and buying eggs that were states and states away would be more fun or beneficial?
I think I always did a really good job of sharing behind the scenes of our chickens. Like it was almost natural because I would share my daughter picking the eggs, so people knew how closely connected the eggs were to the end product. I think that also our eggs were really big and looked really healthy and tasted really healthy. Again, we had under 50 chickens, so they were never graded, but they were really nice eggs, and I think people knew that, and so they would come back because of that. But I feel like it was always I'm sharing about our farm and what we do here, and people were connected personally to us. And I will say that we did have to get an extra fridge for our eggs. Mm-hmm. If we're talking expenses at all, we had to get an extra fridge because our personal fridge can hold that many eggs all at once, because we were getting, I think at one point roughly like 40 to 45 eggs a day.
Wow. Yeah. That kind of goes into this idea of calculating costs, mm-hmm. expenses versus what you're bringing in. So when you started this, I know it kind of started a little more informally and then it grew from there. Did you ever really, like, what were your goals when it came to selling your eggs? Did you ever do any big cost and income analysis? Did you find that you were making a profit? Mm-hmm. Or if you weren't measuring it by that, like what were the measurements of success for you for the egg business?
Yeah, I would say we were probably not the greatest at like measuring it super exactly, just because we were in that hobby phase. I think if we would have gotten more serious about getting more chickens, then we would have. But we always had in mind how much we were spending for feed and how much we were selling the eggs for. It sounds wild, but I think it was like, is this fun for us? Mm-hmm. Because that's not our main source of income. But it really allowed us to think about like what we were doing with it. And it was something that we really enjoyed. And so we did keep in mind like on pricing, on how much it cost. And there were times where a whole dozen would fall on the ground and it would break. And it was always frustrating because we're like, well, there goes $4 or $5 all at once. And it takes time I think that was maybe the thing that we valued the most, how much time it was taking out of our day, because that is something you have to think about.
Yeah, that's also a cost, your labor.
It's a cost. Our labor, like every morning getting up and going out. And then if it was really hot, making sure they had water in the middle of the day. If it was really cold, making sure, it is time consuming. You have to be available, and that's a huge part of it. So what else can you do during your day? Yeah, I think, we weren't like exact number people, which might mm-hmm. not be super helpful, but I think that the few things I can tell you is managing how much it's costing you to get feed, how much it's costing you if you're, if it's a winter and you're keeping their water warm, how much it's costing you gas if you're delivering the eggs. Like those things are important. Our main goal was to grow our daughter's savings account. Mm-hmm. And we were pretty successful at that.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to keep in mind, because especially for, I think, smaller flocks, sometimes you may not see that profit. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times maybe your goal is, like you were saying, we have all these eggs, like what the heck do we do with them? And, yes. Just finding a new way to create some community, or having that goal of like maybe you have some kids and you want to start a small savings for them or something like that.
Yeah.
That could also be measurements of success.
It taught my daughter, even though she was really young, responsibility. Like now when we have chickens, I know she can go out there and like take care of them on her own. I don't have to supervise it. She can feed them. She can get the eggs. She's much older now, so it's easier, but it definitely taught her the value of one, food, the money involved. And it's not like, we would definitely be like, hey, you can go spend this amount of money for yourself. So it definitely provided funds for her to have a giant stuffed animal collection.
I'm sure she really appreciated that. Brinzy products are designed to be long-lasting and energy efficient. Their advanced series incubators and brooders feature the latest state-of-the-art digital control systems, providing instant readings of temperature and humidity to ensure successful hatches and healthy chicks. Check out Brinzy incubators and more at brinzy.com. That's www.brinsea.com. Well, let me jump back a little bit to a couple more kind of logistical things with the egg business. So, especially considering that hens' egg productivity can fluctuate with age or with the seasons, how did you see any change in that supply and demand over time that you had to account for, especially if there was kind of a growing list of people or anything? So did maybe your communication change and evolve with your customers or anything like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it goes back to, again, like with social media, we would let people know if we didn't have any or we had extra. And we were always really open about, hey, do you know anyone who needs eggs? That kind of thing. And sometimes people wouldn't think about it, but when we would say, they're like, oh, I should get a dozen for my mom or whatever. But it did fluctuate depending on the seasons. I think obviously when there was a lot less sun, they would lay a lot less. We were very specific about the breed that we would get. So we had a lot of Rhode Island Reds and Isa Browns. And then we got kind of, into the Americanas. And so we had less of those and the Olive Eggers less, but we always had a surplus. I mean, I can tell you like Isa Browns and Rhode Island Reds, they're just bred to lay. And so maybe there was like a few weeks out of the year that was like iffy. So it really stayed consistent, and they're so hardy that they would go out. So that didn't cause us much problem if you really plan ahead on the type. You're not going to, if you're selling eggs to sell them and have the most, you're not going to get the hens that are less. I would always see on Instagram like these awesome colorful eggs that people would sell. And I was always like, I really want to sell colorful eggs. And then I got hens that would lay colorful eggs, and I would get less eggs. And so you can do that, but you might want to have a variety so you can keep up with the demand. I think when it got crazy was during the pandemic, because everybody wanted eggs and we couldn't keep up with it. And that was challenging. But we were just like, we don't have any. We'll let you know when we have the next drop, because then we wanted to make sure we had some for ourselves. So we were, communicated quite a bit. And I feel like my Instagram and my Facebook became all about eggs for a while. But it was helpful.
Yeah. That's really good to know. Let's touch a little bit on maybe some regulation stuff or lack thereof when it comes to those smaller flocks. So in the state of Kansas, we have some Kansas egg laws, and some of there's specific laws and regulations that pertain to flocks that are 50 to 200, I believe, and then over 200. But under 50, from what I've read in my research, you're not really held accountable to those same types of laws.
Yeah.
So when you were getting started, was there anything you had to kind of take account for, or maybe even some best practices that you developed, even though you weren't being held accountable from like a state law perspective?
Yeah. So once we figured out that we wanted to have this like hobby business, we decided we weren't going to have any roosters because we didn't want to have extra hens that, would add to that amount. So we gave our neighbor our roosters and kept only hens, which they seem much happier that way. We lost probably the most amount of hens to coyotes where we lived. Even though we had a 6-foot fence, like something would happen and inevitably they would be missing. And so we would really wait until we had, maybe we'd lost, it sounds awful, but we'd lose like 6 or 7, and then we would replace those. And we always had to keep in mind how long it was going to take for them to lay again. So I think we always generally had like 30 to 35 that were always laying, maybe more, maybe 40. There was one time where we did hit almost like that threshold where it becomes, oh, now I have too many. Now this is getting a little bit more serious. I probably need to have someone come out. Then one would die or one would disappear or whatever. And so it just really felt like it wasn't necessary to do that. And you really have to ask yourself the question of like, is this going to be like my business where I'm going to make a living? Because then that becomes multiple chicken coops, and that really becomes a bigger expense. And our goal was really to have this savings account for our daughter and pay off our coop that we got, because we spent quite a bit on a really amazing coop. Mm-hmm. Some of the regulations I would say that I probably put on myself, being the person and the personality that I have, I was like, well, I wanted to be as sustainable as possible and clean. And so I made some rules for ourselves of like how we were going to keep things clean, how many, doing the research, like how many hens are we going to keep in this coop? And are we going to wash the eggs before we deliver them? Are we doing it with water, or are we doing it with the solution? And like all of those things were then presented back again to my social media. That information was given to whoever I was selling them to. And that was like the value that people saw of like what the quality of what we were doing was. That's what sold the eggs. I've had someone sell me eggs and they're not cleaned, and I personally don't like that. And so that was again time consuming of us washing, all these eggs and drying them manually and then putting them in the cartons. It was a family experience, but really keeping in mind of like what is deterring disease for your hens. We hardly ever had any issues with disease or bacteria or anything like that. We just really avoided any of that. Because one, it was really sad to see anyone sick or to have to deal with that. And I think spacing was a really big thing for us. And like, why did we choose to do this and not just buy eggs out of the store, is because we wanted to know that they were treated well and that it was a great environment. And so that's what we did. And I think that follows a lot of what then the regulations are. I think we just didn't have, we didn't have to have anyone come out and grade the eggs or check on the eggs. Mm-hmm. And I think, being a master gardener now, disease is something they have to be really aware of, especially now that we know about, well, I think it's become more common knowledge about the avian flu. And so things like that, that's why they're in place to do that. And I think once it becomes more serious, you're having to get insurance or a business account, and they have to be accounted for in case something does happen.
Right. Yeah. And I pulled up also for our state of Kansas, selling eggs without a license, which is ungraded eggs from your flock of 51 to 250 hens. So not over, well, it is over 200, but it says 51 to 250 hens. There are certain things you have to follow there, such as cleaning and washing your eggs, prepackaging them, labeling them on your carton or container is ungraded, your name and address, things like that. Maintaining your eggs at a temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit or below, selling only directly to consumers. For 50 or fewer hens for the state of Kansas, you are exempt from all regulations. However, if you package ungraded eggs in a used egg container and have not crossed out markings that may have been saying that the original eggs were graded or something, you need to do that.
Yeah.
So there are a couple little things, but like you were saying, with those smaller flocks, a lot of it comes down to maybe just you as the chicken owner. But it's really good to know. And again, this is just for the state of Kansas. Each state's going to be a little bit different.
Yeah. And one thing I wasn't aware of originally is that you can actually buy a surplus of egg cartons that are blank, we still have some, and it's going to take forever for us to go through because I think there's like 500 of them.
I remember
Yeah.
I told you, I remember I collected a bunch of ones from
like,
my
I don't need
grocery
'em.
store. I was like, hey, do you need more acorns? Like, I thought you would. And then you were just like, no.
Yeah. No, I still have a ton, and we have 6 hens now, and I don't sell them anymore, but I give them out to friends and those cartons, and I follow the same practices of cleaning all of them and making sure, like, all those things we followed, but we just didn't have that many hens. But I think ethically, like, that's what everyone should do. That's also going to go into people's bodies, and that's important to me, that no one ever gets sick from something I gave them. Like, that's huge. And so, yeah. And now, I'm in a place where I just give them away, and I have hens that are not as, they're olive eggers, so they're great at laying, but I got them because I love the way they look and I love their personality and they look pretty. So that's more of where we're at now. I think in the future, we'd love to do it again.
Yeah.
And I think going back to the beginning, one thing to keep in mind is how many people around you are selling eggs, because that's really going to impact how many you sell. We were in a really small community where we had one grocery store, and that grocery store sold the regular eggs that you would see at a non-local. And so I think people really appreciate it. And I had other friends who were also selling eggs, and they would message me and say, hey, I'm out of eggs, but this person needs eggs. Can you sell them? So we were working together, and it was really fun for getting to know the community.
Yeah. As we're wrapping up, I have a couple other little questions. Going back to kind of the very beginning, determining whether or not you are able to or should, for lack of a better word, sell eggs. Are there any points of reflection that you would advise someone who keeps chickens and is thinking about selling them and is kind of on the fence about whether or not they want to? Maybe just some things for people to keep in mind as they're trying to make that decision.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is time. It takes a lot more time than you think to be able to do that. Well, 2 things are keeping me from selling eggs. Right now, we don't live in the country. And so I can only have so many chickens. And 2, I don't really have the time to do what we were doing before. And so those 2 things are 2 questions you have to ask yourself. And then space. Do you have the space to have enough hens to sell eggs? And that's, where we had all the space you can imagine. So it didn't matter. And we kind of got ourselves in this situation of like, oh my gosh, what do we do with all of these eggs? We're going to sell them. Oh, and I would say like money. I mean, money does come into a big question here, because you're buying hens and you're buying chicken coops, and chicken coops are not cheap. And so that is one thing to really keep in mind. I think I have a course somewhere where I talk about getting started with chickens, and that was one of the big pieces, because you really have to think about like how many chickens you're going to have in your space. We just got a huge coop, and we're lucky that we had a lot of space and could grow with it. And then we had a second coop that we used temporarily. So those things are time, money, and space are huge. And then, do you love chickens? Do you enjoy picking them up? Are you okay with the mess? Like, those are big things, because they are very messy, and you do have to be able to pick them up. And so if maybe you're someone who's just getting started with chickens and you want to sell eggs, get really comfortable with your hens first before you do that. I have some interesting stories, some that I don't have enough time to tell, but when you have 40 chickens running towards you because you have a treat, like, you have to totally be okay with that. So just keep that in mind. I think that covers it. Yeah.
And then final question, going back to the whole experience and why you started up in the beginning was for your daughter. Do you have any fond memories or any other benefits and points of growth you remember seeing in her as this business was taking off?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was always so excited to go out and do the chores with us. And just the fact of, like, I remember when she was really little, seeing the egg was really exciting. I don't know, it's like that joke of like, what came first? I don't know what happened with her, but like, she loves animals. And I think it's because of the way our lifestyle has always been, not only because we try to be super ethical about our animals, but we've always had multiple dogs, cats, and all these chickens. And she's read Melissa Cahy's book for kids, like from the first page to the end over and over again. She's learned how to speak chicken, like Melissa would say. And it's always been really rewarding to her because they're real and they're right there. And if something happens to one of them, she's sad or she gives them names. And then to top it all off, I get money for this and I get to go spend it sometimes, or I get to learn about what it's like to save money. And so it's something that's always, created a really positive experience for all of us. So yeah, those are some awesome things. I wouldn't trade it. I would do it all over again with her. I think it's a really great learning opportunity. And, the saddest moments have always been when we've lost someone that, we really liked. Like I can think back to like a rooster that I really loved and had a really friendly personality and we connected with, and then we lost that one. And so that was really sad. And it makes you think of like, how many more of these can I have? Because you do get attached.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's so great being able to see those benefits come out of your daughter and how much she enjoyed that whole experience too. That's wonderful.
Yeah. If anything, it got her to read more. So isn't that like the goal as a parent, to get them to read more?
Yeah. Well, those were all the questions that I had. Thank you so much, Q, for coming on and just sharing about your egg business experience, and hopefully gives listeners some inspiration if they are thinking about starting an egg business themselves, whatever size. And again, we'll include some links in the show notes, both to some of Q's projects with us, as well as some links for learning more about some of the regulations per state, depending on the size of the egg business that you want. But thank you again, Q. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Mother Earth News and Friends. To listen to more podcasts and get connected on our social media, visit motherearthnews.com/podcast. You can also email us at podcast@ogdenpubs.com with any questions or suggestions. Our podcast production team includes Jessica Anderson, Kenny Coogan, and Alyssa Warner. Music for this episode is Hustle by Kevin MacLeod. The Mother Earth News and Friends podcast is a production of Ogden Publications. Thanks again to Brinzy, our sponsor for this Mother Earth News and Friends podcast episode. You too can experience the Brinzy difference and maximize your hatch rates with Brinzy incubators that monitor temperature and humidity and are made of antimicrobial materials. Brinzy ships worldwide and provides stellar customer support to answer all your questions. Hatch your chicks with Brinzy, the leader in innovative incubation research. Learn more at brinzy.com. Again, that's www.brinsea.com. Until next time, don't forget to love your mother.